Good day, everyone, and thank you for joining me. My name is Frederick Hampton, and I'm an associate professor at Cleveland State University. I'm a faculty member in educational leadership, and I'm also interim department chairperson for the programs of school administration, counseling, and adult professional higher education. I was asked to prepare this video for the Academic Excellence for All Conference. And this session is titled, The 7 Secrets of Successful Urban Students. The Evidence Continues to Grow. Since this is a video session, I prepared a condensed version of the presentation. However, I'll be very happy to provide you with the full PowerPoint and related publications upon request. So let's begin. Since urban is a key word in my title, let's start there. The state of Ohio has a number of what could be referred to as urban school districts. Although the definitions may vary, in most instances, urban is simply a euphemism for school districts with predominantly Black and Brown students who experience higher rates of poverty and lower rates of academic achievement than all other districts. This is not only the case today, but it's been the case for at least the past 50 years. Children of color experiencing lower than average academic achievement. Think about what have been some of the attempts that you're familiar with that have been made to improve urban student achievement. Some of them that have happened in Ohio and in states around the country include more intensive end-of-grade testing, more stringent graduation tests, more detailed teacher evaluation system. In Ohio, we have the OTES. In Ohio, we also have the 3rd grade reading guarantee. There are teacher-based teams, commonly referred to as TBTs, building leadership teams, district leadership teams, RTI, response to intervention, new technology, lots of smart boards, lots of computers in many, many classrooms across the state right now. Fortunately, many students now have the advantage of one-to-one laptops. Nearly every child in Ohio, or a large percentage of children in Ohio, have access to computers all day and in many instances can take them home in the evenings. There are many new school buildings. And of course, we pay expensive outside consultants to come in and help us with our issues on improving urban student achievement. For a minute, think about in your district, how many programs and projects have been implemented that were designed and that were sold as being some answer to improving urban student achievement? How many grants have been funded for the purpose of improving urban student achievement in your district? How many studies have been conducted? How many dissertations have been written for this purpose? Think about now, what do you have to show for all of these efforts, for all of the time, for all of the money, for all of the policy changes, for all of the meetings? What do you have to show for your efforts over the years? What's been the outcome? What can you point to? What can you put your finger on that says, now we have higher rates of success? What problems have been resolved as a result of these initiatives? What problems have you conquered? What problems existed 10, 12, 15 years ago that no longer exist in your building because you have mastered those problems? Is there evidence? Is there at least some evidence that some of the problems that you experience now in terms of student achievement and also student behavior are worse now than they were before the initiatives were implemented? Here we have a report from 2019 that lists all 608 school districts in the state of Ohio based on their performance index. You can easily find this if you just simply search Ohio School Performance Index, and you will go right to this website. I want to show you very quickly, and I'll scroll through the information quickly because you can find it. I'm going to go to the top 10 districts in the state of Ohio. And as you take a quick look at these, think about what you might find in common. If you're familiar with the state of Ohio, then you may know these communities and you may know these neighborhoods. These are the top 9 districts in the state of Ohio. If you're familiar with these districts, then you would be able to quickly identify some of the demographic characteristics. Now, let's go all the way back and look at the bottom districts in the state of Ohio. And again, we're going to look for what are the common characteristics. These are the bottom districts. As we were defining urban a few minutes ago, most of the districts on this list are defined as urban, particularly East Cleveland, Youngstown, Dayton, Cleveland, Toledo, Columbus, Euclid, Canton, Lorain, Warren, Painesville, Akron, Warrensville Heights. All of these districts would typically be defined as urban. Demographically, all of these districts are similar because either they are heavily composed of Black and brown children, or they're composed of Black and brown children and poorer white and Hispanic children. How can this continue to be? Well, for one reason, in these districts where these educators are working, there are a few things that the educators cannot do. The educators cannot give these children better homes to live in. The educators cannot give their parents better jobs. The educators cannot give their parents college degrees. The educators cannot remove drugs and crime from their neighborhood. There are some other things that we will need to do as educators if we are really going to improve urban student achievement. One of the things that we have to do is to simply tell the children and the families the truth, that nobody is coming to save them. After 50 years and all the data that exists, we have to be honest enough to tell these children and their families, you are going to have to do more to save yourselves. You're going to have to not work as hard as the children in the top 50%, in those top 10 districts. You can't work as hard as those children. You're going to have to work harder than those children if you want to see some of the results that they get. If we actually have any real hopes of making significant change and improvement and having urban students to really become successful learners, then we're really going to have to pay much closer attention to a quote by Albert Einstein, where he said, "Education is not the learning of facts, but it is training the mind to think." We have spent too much time traveling the wrong paths in our urban schools. We've spent too much time asking the wrong questions. We focused on the wrong goals. We have overlooked the most obvious solution to urban student achievement. The solution to urban student achievement, the solution to improved urban student achievement, is really the students themselves. That's where the answer lies. And if we cannot find it there, then we are never going to find it because it does not exist. We've spent too much time in urban schools responding to questions of how can we raise student test scores? Improving student test scores without improving the most meaningful qualities and characteristics of the students really is only smoke and mirrors. We understand why students fail in urban schools. I don't think there's really anything new that can be added to the story of why urban students fail. A more important question and a more important use of time would be when we begin to focus on understanding why urban students succeed in schools, those who do succeed. And there are students who succeed in schools. Something that we should do is to take a closer look and see what those students who succeed in urban schools can actually teach us. So what I want you to do for a minute is to think of a person that you know very well. And some of you might not have to take a lot of time thinking. You might be the person that we're going to talk about for now. Think about a person who, from a statistical perspective, had no right to succeed in school, or for that matter, they had no right to succeed in life. Because from a demographic, economic, social perspective, they had nothing whatsoever in their favor. Let's look at some of these circumstances that we'll find. One of the things that I did to support this case that I'm making today is I make a point to, in urban areas, in Cleveland in particular, to identify students who fit this category of having no statistical reason to succeed in school. When we find those students who not only succeed, but they excel, and they have every statistical odd against them, they are the children that we need to understand. If we find out how those children can succeed with so little, that will teach us more about how we can help the masses of children. So let's take a look at some of the conditions and circumstances of children that children face, but they also have found ways to overcome. They may have been raised in an impoverished family, which is very common. Very common that they may have been raised in a single parent home, raised by grandparents or in foster care, or any other combination that does not include both biological parents. Their families may have existed on public assistance, tough neighborhoods, drugs and crime. Their parents may not have completed high school, or at least they've had very little education beyond high school. One of their parents have spent at least some time incarcerated. They come from homes where education was not emphasized as a priority. Few role models in their homes or neighborhoods. And their parents may have still been teens when they were born. How did those students succeed? What do they have in common? What was it about them that made them persist and persevere and fight their ways and take education very seriously and have dreams that there was a better place, have dreams that it was possible for them to have a better life? What was it about those students that allowed them to overcome? Those are the stories of success. That's what we need to learn. We don't need to focus so much anymore on why students fail. Let's spend some time thinking about why do some of these students succeed in urban schools when statistically speaking, they have no right to success. Of the students that we initially studied, we found that there were some very common characteristics among those students. Actually, there were 7, which is where the title of this article comes from, The 7 Secrets of Successful Urban Students. These students that we found in Cleveland schools shared characteristics that allowed them to be successful in school. Some of the amazing things about these students is that some of them that contributed to this study, and we did this after months of having interviews, after months of having discussions, and after months of listening to the stories of these young urban children. We found out that they had maintained throughout high school A and B averages. If they had planned to go to college, they had successfully completed the SAT or the ACT, depending on which year they were finishing. They had plans and aspirations for life beyond high school. These children had dreams that they believed could be fulfilled. Specifically, some of the children who participated, some of them have won academic scholarships, full academic scholarships. And in these cases, they were scholarships to attend Southern historically HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. There were some full academic scholarships. There were some partial academic scholarships. There were students who also had ambitions of attending college, but they didn't have scholarships and they didn't have money. So some were planning to go into the military where they could go to college and study and have it paid for by the GI Bill. Some of the children wanted to go into professions such as nursing. So after high school, they were going immediately to enroll in community college. As I tell you about some of these students and their plans, these children and what their plans are may seem to be only average at best to you. Their achievements may seem only average or minimal at best. But that depends on where you come from and where you started. Based on where these children started, these are some amazing accomplishments. But let's talk about what tied them together. What were the things that made these children similar in any way? First is that all of the children who participated and contributed to us learning more about urban student success in some manner or another, whether they spoke about it directly or indirectly. It was a common and repeated theme of the importance of self-respect. And as I mentioned these, you have to keep in mind that this is relative to their peers. And this is relative to the neighborhoods and circumstances that they come from. But one thing is for sure, no matter what side of the tracks you're born on, no matter how much money you may have or not have, no matter who your parents are, anybody walking the earth can have self-respect. And it has an impact on everything that you do at school and in life. The second one, the children who participated, they had an unusually high command of standard English for the neighborhoods that they grew up in. They did not sound like, they did not speak like, they did not write like children who came from the upper economic ends of the spectrum. But for their neighborhoods, for their community, for what they had to work with, they had an amazingly high command of standard English, at least to the point where they were able to turn on and turn off the type of English that they spoke. They were well capable of speaking standard English when they chose to, and they were well capable of speaking urban English when they chose to. These children had high degrees of goal-setting ability. Now, in goal-setting ability, it might simply be that they had the ability to focus and prioritize on what they needed to do today to be successful tomorrow, what they needed to do in classes this week and next week in order to get a good grade at the end of the semester, or what they needed to do in terms of getting a part-time job if they needed to purchase some items for themselves. So they knew about goals. They knew about self-motivation. they talked about self-motivation. If you recall some of the circumstances that I mentioned earlier, a lot of these children did not have adults planning and monitoring their lives. A lot of these students really were in a position where they could do pretty much what they wanted to do. If they wanted to go to school, they could go. If they didn't want to go, nobody was going to make them go. If they wanted to study, they could study. If they didn't want to do homework, no one was going to make them do homework. So they had acquired, relative to their peers, higher degrees of self-motivation in terms of understanding what it takes to get from point A to point B in their goals. They had, relative to their peers, high degrees of time management skills. Simple examples would be if they had homework, if they had a test coming up, or if they had a project that was due tomorrow or next week, they knew that they could not leave school, go to the park and play basketball for 3 hours, get home by 7 o'clock, and then eat and play 2 hours of Xbox or PlayStation. And then if they had a few minutes left over before they got too tired, then they would study or then they would work on their projects. They didn't do that. The students who demonstrated these higher levels of achievement, they had acquired the skills to prioritize what is it that they needed to do to be able to accomplish their goals. So if they did have homework, then that became a priority for them early in the day. Now, all of these students, they very much enjoyed playing basketball. They very much enjoyed Xbox and PlayStation. They very much enjoyed videos, movies, talking to their boyfriends or talking to their girlfriends. But they managed to get the important things done first, and then they could use their additional time to do those other things that they enjoyed. Consequence awareness was a theme that continually came up in this group of students that were understudied. Consequence awareness, the shortcut answer is these students spent more time thinking before they acted. They did not fly off the handle and do things. They considered the consequences of their behaviors before they made any significant moves. Now, they were and behaved like teenagers do. They did not behave like adults, but they would consider things like, if I do X, then what is going to be the corresponding Y? They considered that there were consequences, either positive or negative, for their behaviors throughout the day. So having an awareness that whatever you do is going to lead to some other event that may be positive or negative, these were things that they kept in mind. But remember, this is relative to their peers and relative to their neighborhoods and circumstances that they grew up in. The final one, all of these are interesting. This may be the most interesting. And you also have to think about, how does any of this tie into education and learning? The final one was they talked about the need for having a respect for others. Now, it may not be the same way that you think about the importance of having respect for others, but when you come out of an urban area, and if you can survive, and if you can succeed, and if you can excel, sometimes having a healthy respect for others, it may mean simply minding your own business and not getting dragged into trouble. But for many of these children, they figured something out that not only helped them as students, but will help them throughout life. That when you show respect for others and when you show courtesy, you end up getting more benefits of the doubt. You end up getting more opportunities. You end up in a position where people are willing to give you a second chance, where people are willing to give you a break. So depending on your behavior, depending on how you carry yourself, depending on the levels of respect that you show others, two things might happen. One, it's going to keep you out of trouble. It'll keep you from getting hurt. And you are more likely to get an advantage by showing respect and courtesy than you are by showing constantly how tough you can be. You might say that's a cute and maybe interesting story about a few urban students, but that doesn't really prove anything. And quite honestly, you would be right. But imagine this. Imagine you're a teacher in an urban school. It's the first day of school. You have 25 new students. You don't have any achievement, testing, behavior, or attendance data on them. All you know is that most of the students will routinely exhibit most of these behaviors, or at least they'll exhibit perhaps 7 out of 10 of them. The question becomes, can you teach this class based on these 7 behaviors on the screen? Based on these 7 behaviors on the screen, if they are routinely exhibited, will these students learn? If your answer is yes, then this is important. This becomes the student's contribution to their own learning. This is their end of the bargain. And maybe, just maybe, instead of spending so much time focusing on creative and innovative ways to only raise test scores, maybe we should spend some of that time and some of that money teaching, developing, enhancing, and having students internalize these attitudes, behaviors, and characteristics. It's more than just an interesting idea. There's science to support it. If we first focus on teaching students to learn how to learn, then higher test scores will have more meaning. So let me show you what I mean. So we did do a qualitative study that explored and developed the basis from a few urban students individually. Then I took this to a broader quantitative study in the city of Cleveland, where there were 10 or 12 schools involved. There were a total of 157 urban students, only in grades 4 through 10. Now, these next pages will give you a brief but quick and clear understanding of how we brought more science into this. Most of my students at the university are classroom teachers. So during a semester, at the beginning of the year, similar to where it is now, in August, when the school year was just starting, I asked my students in several classes to collect some data for me. I did not tell the teachers everything that this data was going to be used for, because I did not want them to become biased. So what I had teachers do was to select a period of the day that they were teaching. It did not matter the subject. Or if they were self-contained teachers, I had them select a subject. So it could have been 7th grade math, then they might have selected 3rd period. It could have been a 5th grade self-contained classroom, and they might have selected science. So with that, I asked them to only, for a semester, so if the grading period was typically 8 or 9 weeks, I only asked them to observe that particular group of students for the semester and rate them on their behaviors, these 7 behaviors that we have been talking about. I didn't give them any additional information. I said, observe these students, take the 6, 7, 8 weeks to get to know them, and then rate these students on these behaviors, whether you would rate them in terms of good, average, or poor in each of these behaviors. They did that. They collected the data. They recalled who the individual students were, and they gave me that information, but they did not know what I was going to do with it. This happened before report cards came out. After report cards came out, that's when I let the students in on part 2 of the survey. They actually didn't know it was going to be a part 2. Part 2 of the survey asked these teachers to then go back and pair up, match the students, their behaviors with the grades that they achieved. So the teachers would identify the students, it was a male or it was a female, the race of the student. And then they would say, what was the grade this child earned in this particular subject? So then we had two important points of data. We had a quarter of data where the teachers had really gotten to know the students, and then they were able to fairly and accurately assess the students on their 7 behaviors. Then, without the teachers knowing, they came back and reported what grade did the child earn in that particular subject. Here's where some very, very strong correlations came in. Of all of the 7 characteristics and the correlated with the grades that the students the grades that the students earned, there were high significant correlations between the grades and these particular behaviors that the students exhibited. Most of the correlations ranged from 0.5 to 0.8 in terms of determining the predictability of an academic outcome. So this chart may be too small for you to see. I'm certainly not going to read all the numbers to you. However, my email was at the beginning of this presentation. If you email me, I will give you the study where you can examine these numbers yourself. The important thing here is that there were very high correlations between students who exhibited more of these characteristics and the higher grades that they achieved. Strong correlations. The more of these characteristics this child exhibited, the higher their grades were. The fewer of these characteristics the child exhibited, the lower their grades were. And we had really good data to support that. The important thing here in this linear regression is this adjusted R-square, which is 0.669, which basically means this. If you know the characteristics, these 7 characteristics that the children exhibit, you have nearly a 70% chance of accurately predicting what grade they are going to receive in a particular subject. If you know how well the children perform and demonstrate and exhibit those 7 characteristics or more of those 7 characteristics, you will then be able to predict what grade range that child is going to perform in. So let's consider this and the importance of it. If we know which students demonstrate most of these attitudes and behaviors, then we can fairly accurately predict which students will have higher achievement. Let's think about the reverse of that, because this is equally important. If we know which students demonstrate the highest achievement in a class, we also know which students are going to demonstrate more of these characteristics. That is quite powerful because it leads me to this position. Instead of prepping children to pass tests, if we spend more time with these children, having them develop these characteristics, these behaviors, these attitudes, and these skills, the scores will also rise. Their test scores will also rise. But in these circumstances, children who have developed these characteristics, exhibit them, internalize them, practice them, work on them. When you get higher test scores as a result of changed behaviors, then the test scores have more meaning and it's a truer indication of their academic ability. Too many times in schools, we have individual buildings or we have individual districts who will tout and be very proud of the high test scores that their children have demonstrated, that their children have achieved, what they are able to publish in the newspapers. But if you ask the teachers, the administrators, okay, I see that your children have better test performance now. Can you tell me what explains that? What's different about the child? How has the child's behavior changed? If anyone ever gives you a story about increased test scores among urban students, but they have no idea how the children changed, what the children are doing differently, how their attitudes have changed, how their behavior is different, how they take learning more seriously, how they contribute and take some responsibility for their own learning, then all you have are a set of numbers that have very little meaning. Changes in test scores without changes in student behavior leads us back to where we started at the beginning. Black and brown children having lower achievement than all others. So, to conclude this presentation, I'd like to mention something from a noted scientist by the name of Carl Sagan, who unfortunately is no longer with us. But he had a favorite saying. He used to always say that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I like to apply that philosophy to schools, particularly when we talk about raising student test scores or whatever that's worth. At any point, if you're going to talk about how you have raised test scores, particularly in urban areas, you should at least have the decency to provide some extraordinary evidence other than the scores themselves. Whenever we talk about test score improvement in urban schools, we should simultaneously be required to talk about evidence of how and where and why the students have changed. I have this thing that I refer as APSO, and it has everything to do with urban learners. If we can change students' attitudes, then we can change their behaviors. If we can change their behaviors, then we can change their skills. And if we can change their skills, then we can change their outcomes. Outcomes in schools, outcomes in urban education typically equate with test scores, and pretty much test scores only. Our mistake is we start our day, and our urban institutions are currently built around the idea of changing outcomes, changing test scores, without changing any of the elements that would lead to such changed outcomes and such improvement. Without changes in student attitudes, behaviors, and skills, discussing changes in test scores is actually meaningless. But we know that student attitudes, behaviors, and skills can change. They do change, and when they do, we get some results that actually make a difference, and we get some results that we can rely on. What we know that those successful learner characteristics, those 7 elements that we've been talking about for the entire presentation, if you go back and take a look at them, you will notice they cannot be purchased. There is no dollar amount that you can assign to purchasing self-respect, respect for others, self-motivation, time management, consequence awareness. Any of the 7, they cannot be purchased, but they can be acquired, they can be developed, and they can be strengthened. And they are elements that the students need to be successful learners. We also know that any students with successful attitudes, behaviors, and skills can be successful learners. And if you want those higher test scores, that's the route that we must take, changing attitudes and behaviors first, and the test scores and outcomes will come along later. Any individual student, regardless of how difficult their personal circumstances have been, and I don't want to make light of that because some children have experienced tragedies and difficulties that most of us will never know. But even with that, those students can be successful. I believe or I'm convinced that unless we do more to help those students develop those 7 characteristics, attitudes, and behaviors, learning is not going to take place, not long-term meaningful learning that's going to make a difference in their lives. You can have reports that show that you have improved test scores, but it's going to be smoke and mirrors unless you can discuss and have confidence and provide evidence of how the students themselves have changed. Also, incorporating the teaching of successful learner characteristics, those 7 elements, it has to be incorporated into the school curriculum on a daily basis. We cannot think of incorporating these, helping students to develop these skills as add-on other burdensome activities. There are significant, simple, meaningful, easy ways to incorporate the teaching of those 7 characteristics into the school day. We can incorporate them into the lessons. We can incorporate them into the daily lives of school activities. It just takes a little bit of creativity and a little bit of thought. One word that I personally try to avoid saying is achievement gap. So I guess that's 2 words. But based on this, based on the research and my years of study, I'm of the opinion now that for urban students, there is actually less of an achievement gap than we think it is, but more of a gap in those attitudes, behaviors, and skills that lead to achievement. I think too often we equate achievement with ability, which is an inaccurate way to look at student performance. Achievement is actually what they demonstrate. Ability is what they are capable of doing. And most of the time, we know very little about what these students are capable of doing in terms of what we have in documented form. We know urban students are capable, but they don't demonstrate it on the assessments that we currently use. Okay, my very last thing. I know that we wish we lived in a fair and equitable society, and there are good people that are working to make that happen, but we're not there yet. We wish urban students were on a level playing field and had all the advantages of others, but they don't. So we have a choice to make. We can either sit back and wait until the day comes when everything is going to be equal, which I would not advise, or we can start to give these students what they need to take control of their own lives, which in part, I think in big part, are those 7 elements that they not only need to be successful learners, that they not only need to demonstrate higher academic achievement, that they don't only need to demonstrate and have better test performance, but they are characteristics that are going to enable them to not just be successful students. Those characteristics, when fully developed, are going to enable them to have successful lives. Thank you for joining me. I enjoyed this presentation. And again, get my number from the beginning of this presentation. You have my phone number there. There's my email address there. If you contact me, I will attach this presentation, and I will also attach the article that demonstrates and talks about the 7 characteristics of successful urban students. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day.